Chapter 6. Some of the Duties of the President. As I recall the mounting events of the years I spent in Washington, I appreciate how impossible it is to convey an adequate realization of the office of President. A few short paragraphs in the Constitution of the United States describe all his fundamental duties. Various laws passed over a period of nearly a century and a half have supplemented his authority. All of his actions can be analyzed. All of his goings and comings can be recited. The details of his daily life can be made known. The effect of his policies on his own country and on the world at large can be estimated. His methods of work, his associates, his place of abode, can all be described. But the relationship created by all these and more, which constitutes the magnitude of the office, does not yield to definition. Like the glory of a morning sunrise, it can only be experienced. It cannot be told. In the discharge of the duties of the office, there is one rule of action more important than all others. It consists in never doing anything that someone else can do for you. Like many other good rules, it is proven by its exceptions, but it indicates a course that should be very strictly followed in order to prevent being so entirely devoted to trifling details that there will be little opportunity to give the necessary consideration to policies of larger importance. Like some other rules, this one has an important corollary which must be carefully observed in order to secure success. It is not sufficient to entrust details to someone else. They must be entrusted to someone who is competent. The Presidency is primarily an executive office. It is placed at the apex of our system of government. It is a place of last resort to which all questions are brought that others have not been able to answer. The ideal way for it to function is to assign to the various positions men of sufficient ability so that they can solve all the problems that arise under their jurisdiction. If there is a troublesome situation in Nicaragua, a General McCoy can manage it. If we have differences with Mexico, a Morrow can compose them. If there is unrest in the Philippines, a Stimson can quiet them. About a dozen able, courageous, reliable, and experienced men in the House and Senate can reduce the problem of legislation almost to a vanishing point. While it is wise for the President to get all the competent advice possible, final judgments are necessarily his own. No one can share with him the responsibility for them. No one can make his decisions for him. He stands at the center of things where no one else can stand. If others make mistakes, they can be relieved, and oftentimes a remedy can be provided. But he cannot retire. His decisions are final and usually irreparable. This constitutes the appalling burden of his office. Not only the welfare of 120 million of his countrymen, but oftentimes the peaceful relations of the world are entrusted to his keeping. At the turn of his hand, the guns of an enormous fleet would go into action anywhere in the world, carrying the iron might of death and destruction. His appointment confers the power to administer justice, inflict criminal penalties, declares acts of state legislatures and of the Congress void, and sit in judgment over the very life of the nation. Practically all the civil and military authorities of the government, except the Congress and the courts, hold their office at his discretion. He appoints and he can remove. The billions of dollars of government revenue are collected and expended under his direction. The Congress makes the laws, but it is the President who causes them to be executed. A power so vast in its implications has never been conferred upon any ruling sovereign. Yet the President exercises his authority in accordance with the Constitution and the law. He is truly the agent of the people, performing such functions as they have entrusted to him. The Constitution specifically vests him with the executive power. Some presidents have seemed to interpret that as an authorization to take any action which the Constitution, or perhaps the law, does not specifically prohibit. Others have considered that their powers extend only to such acts as were specifically authorized by the Constitution and the statutes. This has always seemed to me to be a hypothetical question, which it would be idle to attempt to determine in advance. It would appear to be the better practice to wait to decide each question on its merits as it arises. Jefferson is said to have entertained the opinion that there was no constitutional warrant for enlarging the territory of the United States, but when the actual facts confronted him, he did not hesitate to negotiate the Louisiana Purchase. For all ordinary occasions, the specific powers assigned to the President will be found sufficient to provide for the welfare of the country. That is all he needs. All situations that arise are likely to be simplified, and many of them completely solved, by an application of the Constitution and the law. If what they require to be done is done, there is no opportunity for criticism, and it would be seldom that anything better could be devised. A commission once came to me with a proposal for adopting rules to regulate the conduct of its members. As they were evenly divided, each side wished me to decide against the other. They did this because, while it is always the nature of a commissioner to claim that he is entirely independent of the President, he would usually welcome presidential interference with any other commissioner who does not agree with him. In this case, it occurred to me that the Department of Justice should ascertain what the statute setting up this commission required under the circumstances. A reference to the law disclosed that the Congress had specified the qualifications of the members of this commission, and that they could not by rule either enlarge or diminish the power of their individual members. So their problem was solved like many others by simply finding out what the law required. Every day of the presidential life is crowded with activities. When people not accustomed to Washington came to the office, or when I met them on some special occasion, they often remarked that it seemed to be my busy day, to which my stock reply came to be that all days were busy, and there was little difference among them. It was my custom to be out of bed about 6:30, except in the darkest mornings of winter. One of the doormen at the White House was an excellent barber, but I always preferred to shave myself with old-fashioned razors, which I knew how to keep in good condition. It was my intention to take a short walk before breakfast, which Mrs. Coolidge and I ate together in our rooms. For me, there was fruit and about 1/2 cup of coffee, with a homemade cereal made from boiling together 2 parts of unground wheat with 1 part of rye. To this was added a roll and a strip of bacon, which went mostly to our dogs. Soon after 8 found me dictating in the White House library in preparation for some public utterance. This would go on for more than an hour, after which I began to receive callers at the office. Most of these came by appointment, but in addition to the average of 6 to 8 who were listed, there would be as many more from my cabinet and the Congress, to whom I was always accessible. Each one came to me with a different problem requiring my decision, which was usually made at once. About 12:15, those began to be brought in who were to be somewhat formally presented. At 12:30 the doors were opened, and a long line passed by who wished merely to shake hands with the President. On one occasion I shook hands with 1934 minutes, which is probably my record. Instead of a burden, it was a pleasure and a relief to meet people in that way, and listen to their greetings, which was often a benediction. It was at this same hour that the numerous groups assembled in the South grounds, where I joined them for the photographs used for news purposes and permanent mementos of their White House visit. Lunch came at 1 o'clock, at which we usually had guests. It made an opportunity for giving our friends a little more attention than could be extended through a mere handshake. About an hour was devoted to rest before returning to the office, where the afternoon was reserved for attention to the immense number of documents which pass over the desk of the President. These were all cleaned up each day. Before dinner, another walk was in order, followed by exercises on some of the vibrating machines kept in my room. We gathered at the dinner table at 7 o'clock, and within 3/4 of an hour work would be resumed with my stenographer to continue until about 10 o'clock. The White House offices are under the direction of the Secretary to the President. They are the center of activities, which are worldwide. Reports come in daily from heads of departments, from distant possessions, and from foreign diplomats and consular agents scattered all over the earth. A mass of correspondence from the Congress, the officials of the states, and the general public is constantly being received. All of this often reaches 2,000 pieces in a day. Very much of it is sent at once to the department to which it refers, from which an answer is sent direct to the writer. Other parts are sent to different members of the office staff, and some is laid before the President. While I signed many letters, I did not dictate many. After indicating the nature of the reply, it was usually put into form by some of the secretaries. A great many photographs were sent in to be inscribed, and a constant stream of autographs went to all who wrote for them. At 10:30 on Tuesdays and Fridays, the cabinet meetings were held. These were always very informal. Each member was asked if he had any problem he wished to lay before the President. When I first attended with President Harding at the beginning of a new administration, these were rather numerous. Later, they decreased, as each member felt better able to solve his own problems. After entire freedom of discussion, but always without a vote of any kind, I was accustomed to announce what the decision should be. There never ought to be, and never were marked, differences of opinion in my cabinet. As their duties were not to advise each other, but to advise the President, they could not disagree among themselves. I rarely failed to accept their recommendations. Sometimes they wished for larger appropriations than the state of the Treasury warranted, but they all cooperated most sincerely in the policy of economy, and were content with such funds as I could assign to them. The Secretary of State is the agency through which the President exercises his constitutional authority to deal with foreign relations. As this subject is a matter of constant interchange, he makes no annual report upon it. Other cabinet officers make annual reports to the President on the whole conduct of their departments, which he transmits to the Congress. All the intercourse with foreign governments is carried on through the Secretary of State, and a national of a foreign country cannot be received by the President unless the accredited diplomatic representatives of his government has made an appointment for him through the State Department. All foreign approaches to the President are through this department. When an ambassador or minister is to present his credentials, the Under-Secretary of State brings him to the White House and escorts him to the Green Room. After the Vice President has taken his position standing in the Blue Room, accompanied by his aides, the diplomat is then brought before him. He presents his letters with a short formal statement, to which the President responds in kind. When the mutual expressions of friendly interest and goodwill have been exchanged, the accompanying staff of the diplomat is brought in for formal presentation, after which he retires. Except when foreign officials are presented for an audience in this way, the etiquette of the White House requires that those who are present should remain until the President and the Mistress of the White House retire from the room. A competent man is assigned from the State Department to have the management of the White House official social function. He has under him a considerable staff located in one of the basement rooms, known as the Social Bureau. They keep a careful list of all those who leave cards and of the officials who should be invited to receptions, which is constantly revised to meet changing conditions. While the President has supervision over all these functions, the most effective way to deal with them is to provide a capable mistress of the White House. I have often been complimented on the choice which I made nearly 25 years ago. These functions were so much in the hands of Mrs. Coolidge that oftentimes I did not know what guests were to be present until I met them in the Blue Room just before going in to dinner. These social functions are almost as much a part of the life of official Washington as a session of the Congress or a term of the Supreme Court. The session opens with the Cabinet dinner. Following this come the diplomatic reception, the diplomatic dinner, then the judicial reception, the Supreme Court dinner, then the congressional reception and the Speaker's dinner, with the last reception of the year tendered to the Army and Navy. About 50 guests assemble at the dinners, except that given to the diplomats, when the presence of the ambassadors or ministers with their wives of all countries represented in Washington brings the number up to about 90. The Marine Band is in attendance on all these occasions. Following the dinners, a short musical recital by famous artists is given in the East Room, to which many additional guests are invited. A reception is a particularly colorful event. About 3,500 invitations are issued. When the guests are assembled, the President and his wife, preceded by his aides, and followed by the Cabinet and his secretary, and their wives, go down the main staircase, pausing for a moment to receive the military salute of the band, and then pass to the Blue Room, where the receptions are always held. When the foreign diplomats are present in their official dress, the scene is very brilliant. After all the presentations have been made, the President and his retinue return to the second floor. Immediately after this, there is dancing in the East Room to furnish entertainment, while the long line of cars comes up to take guests home. Whenever the prominent officials of foreign governments visit Washington, it is customary to receive them at a luncheon or dinner at the White House. When the Prince of Wales was here in 1924, we were in mourning due to the loss of our son, so that he lunched with us informally without any other invited guests. When the Queen of Romania came to Washington, she was entertained at dinner. There have also been princes of the reigning house of Japan and of Sweden, the Premier of France, the Governor-General of Canada, the Presidents of the Irish Free State, of Cuba, and of Mexico, who have been received and entertained in some manner. Whenever an official gathering of foreigners, like the Panama Conference, convenes in Washington, the President and the Mistress of the White House tender them a reception and a dinner. Besides these formal social gatherings, there were various afternoon teas and musicales, which I sometimes neglected, and usually one or two garden parties held in the South grounds, one of which was for the disabled veterans who were patients in Washington hospitals. These parties were accompanied with band music and light refreshments, which always seemed to be appreciated by the veterans. My personal social functions consisted of the White House breakfasts, which were attended by 15 to 25 members of the House and Senate and others, who gathered around my table at 8:30 o'clock in the morning to partake of a meal which ended with wheat cakes and Vermont maple syrup. During the last session of the Congress, I invited all the members of the Senate, all the chairman and ranking Democratic members of the committees of the House, and finally had breakfast with the officers of both houses of the Congress. Although we did not undertake to discuss matters of public business at these breakfasts, they were productive of a spirit of good fellowship, which was no doubt a helpful influence to the transaction of public business. In addition to these White House events, the President and his wife go out on 12 official dinners. They begin with the Vice President, go on among the 10 members of the Cabinet, and close with the Speaker of the House. Aside from these, it is not customary for the President to accept the hospitality of any individuals. This is not from any desire on his part to be exclusive, but rather arises from an application of the principle of equality. The number of days in his term of office is limited. If he gave up all the time when he is not otherwise necessarily engaged, it is doubtful if he could find 50 evenings in a year when he could accept invitations. At once he would be confronted with the necessity of deciding which to accept and which to reject. If he served 8 years, he could only touch the fringe of official Washington, even if he chose to disregard all the balance of the country. The only escape from an otherwise impossible situation is to observe the rule of refusing all social invitations. The President stands at the head of all official and social rank in the nation. As he is Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy, all their officers are his subordinates. As he is the head of the government, he outranks all other public officials. As the first citizen, he is placed at the top of the social scale. Wherever he goes, wherever he appears, he must be assigned the place of honor. It follows from this that he cannot consistently attend a dinner or any other function given by someone else in honor of any other person. He can have ceremonies of his own at the White House or outside, in which he recognizes the merit of others and bestows upon them appropriate honors, but his participation in any other occasion of such a nature is confined to sending an appropriate message. It would make great confusion in all White House relations unless the rules of procedure were observed. If this were not done, the most ambitious and intruding would seize the place of honor, or it would be bestowed by favor. In both cases, all official position would be ignored. In its working out, therefore, the adoption of rules which take no account of persons, but simply apply to places, is the only method which is in harmony with our spirit of equality. In its application, it gives us more completely a government of laws and not of men. As he is head of the government, charged with making appointments, and clothed with the executive power, the President has a certain responsibility for the conduct of all departments, commissions, and independent bureaus. While I was willing to advise with any of these officers and give them any assistance in my power, I always felt they should make their own decisions and rarely volunteered any advice. Many applications are made requesting the President to seek to influence these bodies, and such applications were usually transmitted to them for their information without comment. Wherever they exercised judicial functions, I always felt that some impropriety might attach to any suggestions from me. The parties before them are entitled to a fair trial on the merits of their case, and to have judgment rendered by those to whom both sides have presented their evidence. If someone on the outside undertook to interfere, even if grave injustice was not done, the integrity of a commission which comes from a knowledge that it can be relied on to exercise its own independent judgment would be very much impaired. I never hesitated to ask commissions to speed up their work and get their business done, but if they were not doing it correctly, my remedy would be to supplant them with those who I thought would do better. At one time, the Shipping Board adopted a resolution declaring their independence of the Presidents and claiming they were responsible solely to the Congress. As I always considered they had a rather impossible task, I doubted whether any one could be very successful in its performance. If they wished to try to relieve me of its responsibility, I had no personal objection and would probably be saved from considerable criticism, but they found they could not carry on their work without the support of the President, so that some of them resigned and the remainder re-established their contact with the White House, which was always open to them. The practice which I followed in my relations with commissions and in the recognition of rank has been long established. President Jefferson seems to have entertained the opinion that even the Supreme Court should be influenced by his wishes, and that failing in this, a recalcitrant judge should be impeached by a complacent Congress. This brought him into a sharp conflict with John Marshall, who resisted any encroachment upon the independence of the court. In this controversy, the position of Marshall has been vindicated. It is also said that at some of his official dinners, President Jefferson left all his guests to the confusion of taking whatever seats they could find at his table. But this method did not survive the test of history. In spite of all his greatness, anyone who has had many ideas as Jefferson was bound to find that some of them would not work. But this does not detract from the wisdom of his faith in the people and his constant insistence that they be left to manage their own affairs. His opposition to bureaucracy will bear careful analysis, and the country could stand a great deal more of its application. The trouble with us is that we talk about Jefferson but do not follow him. In his theory that the people should manage their government, and not be managed by it, he was everlastingly right. Tradition and custom, it will be seen, are oftentimes determining factors in the presidential office, as they are in all other walks of life. This is not because they are arbitrary or artificial, but because long experience has demonstrated that they are the best methods of dealing with human affairs. Things are done in a certain way after many repetitions show that way causes the least friction, and is most likely to bring the desired result. While there are times when the people might enjoy the spectacular, in the end they will only be satisfied with accomplishments. The President gets the best advice he can find, uses the best judgment at his command, and leaves the event in the hands of Providence. Everything that the President does, potentially at least, is of such great importance that he must be constantly on guard. This applies not only to himself, but to everybody about him, not only in all his official actions, but in all his social intercourse, and even in his recreation and repose. He is constantly watched by a multitude of eyes to determine if there is anything unusual, extraordinary, or irregular which can be set down in praise or in blame. Oftentimes trifling incidents, some insignificant action, an unfortunate phrase in an address, an injudicious letter, a lack of patience towards someone who presents an impossible proposition, too much attention to one person, or too little courtesy towards another, become magnified into the sensation of the hour. While such events finally sink into their proper place in history as too small for consideration, if they occur frequently, they create an atmosphere of distraction that might seriously interfere with the conduct of public business, which is really important. It was my desire to maintain about the White House, as far as possible, an attitude of simplicity, and not engage in anything that had an air of pretentious display. That was my conception of the great office. It carries sufficient power within itself, so that it does not require any of the outward trappings of pomp and splendor for the purpose of creating an impression. It has a dignity of its own which makes it self-sufficient. Of course, there should be proper formality, and personal relations should be conducted at all times with decorum and dignity, and in accordance with the best traditions of polite society, but there is no need of theatricals. But, however much he may deplore it, the President ceases to be an ordinary citizen. In order to function at all, he has to be surrounded with many safeguards. If these were removed for only a short time, he would be overwhelmed by the people who would surge in upon him. In traveling, it would be agreeable to me to use the regular trains which are open to the public. I have done so once or twice, but I found it made great difficulty for the railroads. They reported that it was unsafe, because they could not take the necessary precautions. It therefore seemed best to run a second section, following a regular train, for the exclusive use of the President and his party. While the facilities of a private car have always been offered, I think they have only been used once, when one was needed for the better comfort of Mrs. Coolidge during her illness. Although I have not been given to much travel during my term of office, it has been sufficient, so that I am convinced the government should own a private car for the use of the President when he leaves Washington. The pressure on him is so great, the responsibilities are so heavy, that it is wise public policy in order to secure his best services, to provide him with such ample facilities that he will be relieved as far as possible from all physical inconveniences. It is not generally understood how much detail is involved in any journey of the President. 1 or 2 Secret Service men must go to the destination several days in advance. His line of travel and every street and location which he is to visit are carefully examined. The order of ceremonies has to be submitted for approval. Oftentimes the local police are inadequate, so that it is necessary to use some of the military or naval forces to assist them. Not only his aides and his personal physician, but also Secret Service men, some of his office force, and house servants have to be in attendance. Quarters must also be provided for a large retinue of newspaper reporters and cameramen, who follow him upon all occasions. Every switch that he goes over is spiked down. Every freight train that he passes is stopped, and every passenger train slowed down to 10 miles per hour. While all of this proceeds smoothly, it requires careful attention to a great variety of details. It has never been my practice to speak from rear platforms. The confusion is so great that few people could hear, and it does not seem to me very dignified. When the President speaks, it ought to be an event. The excuse for such appearances, which formerly existed, has been eliminated by the coming of the radio. It is so often that the President is on the air that almost anyone who wishes has ample opportunity to hear his voice. It has seemed more appropriate for Mrs. Coolidge and me to appear at the rear of the train, where the people could see us. About the only time that I have spoken was at Bennington in September of 1928, where I expressed my affection and respect for the people of the state of Vermont, as I was passing through that town on my way back to Washington. I found that the love I had for the hills where I was born touched a responsive chord in the heart of the whole nation. One of the most appalling trials which confront a president is the perpetual clamor for public utterances. Invitations are constant and pressing. They come by wire, by mail, and by delegations. No event of importance is celebrated anywhere in the United States without inviting him to come to deliver an oration. When others are enjoying a holiday, he is expected to make a public appearance in order to entertain and instruct by a formal address. There are a few public statements that he does not deliver in person, like proclamations and messages which go to the Congress, either reporting his views on the State of the Union in his annual message, or giving his reasons for rejecting legislation in a veto. These productions vary in length. My annual message would be about 12,000 words. My speeches would average a little over 3,000 words. In the course of a year, the entire number reaches about 20, which probably represents an output of at least 75,000 words. This kind of work is very exacting. It requires the most laborious and extended research and study, and the most careful and painstaking thought. Each word has to be weighed in the realization that it is a presidential utterance, which will be dissected at home and abroad to discover its outward meaning and any possible hidden implications. Before it is finished, it is thoroughly examined by one or two of my staff, and oftentimes by a member of the cabinet. It is not difficult for me to deliver an address. The difficulty lies in its preparation. This is an important part of the work of a president, which he cannot escape. It is inherent in the office. A great many presents come to the White House, which are all cherished, not so much for their intrinsic value, as because they are tokens of esteem and affection. Almost everything that can be eaten comes. We always know what to do with that. But some of the pets that are offered us are more of a problem. I have a beautiful black-haired bear that was brought all the way from Mexico in a truck, and a pair of live lion cubs now grown up, and a small species of hippopotamus which came from South Africa. These and other animals and birds have been placed in the zoological quarters in Rock Creek Park. We always had more dogs than we could take care of. My favorites were the white collies, which became so much associated with me that they are enshrined in my bookplate, where they will live as long as our country endures. One of them, Prudence Prim, was especially attached to Mrs. Coolidge. We lost her in the Black Hills. She lies out there in the shadow of Bear Butte, where the Indians told me the Great Spirit came to commune with his children. One was my companion, Rob Roy. He was a stately gentleman of great courage and fidelity. He loved to bark from the second-story windows and around the south grounds. Nights he remained in my room, and afternoons went with me to the office. His especial delight was to ride with me in the boats when I went fishing. Although I know he would bark for joy as the grim boatman ferried him across the dark waters of the Styx, yet his going left me lonely on the hither shore. As I left office, I realized that the more I had seen of the workings of the federal government, the more respect I came to have for it. It is carried on by hundreds of thousands of people. Some prove incompetent. A very few are tempted to become disloyal to their trust. But the great rank and file of them are of good ability, conscientious, and faithful public servants. While some are paid more than they would earn in private life, there are great throngs who are serving at a distinct personal sacrifice. Among the higher officials, this is almost always true. The service they perform entitles them to approbation and honor. The Congress has sometimes been a sore trial to presidents. I did not find it so in my case. Among them were men of wonderful ability and veteran experience. I think they made their decisions with an honest purpose to serve their country. The membership of the Senate changed very much by reason of those who sacrificed themselves for public duty. Of all public officials with whom I have ever been acquainted, the work of a Senator of the United States is by far the most laborious. About 20 of them died during the 8 years I was in Washington. Sometimes it would seem for a day that either the House or the Senate had taken some unwise action, but if it was not corrected on the floor where it occurred, it was usually remedied in the other chamber. I always found the members of both parties willing to confer with me and disposed to treat my recommendations fairly. Most of the differences could be adjusted by personal discussion. Sometimes I made an appeal direct to the country by stating my position at the newspaper conferences. I adopted that course in relation to the Mississippi Flood Control Bill. As it passed the Senate, it appeared to be much too extravagant in its rule of damages and its proposed remedy. The press began a vigorous discussion of the subject, which caused the House greatly to modify the bill, and in conference a measure that was entirely fair and moderate was adopted. On other occasions I appealed to the country more privately, enlisting the influence of labor and trade organizations upon the Congress in behalf of some measures in which I was interested. That was done in the case of the tax bill of 1928. As it passed the House, the reductions were so large that the revenue necessary to meet the public expenses would not have been furnished. By quietly making this known to the Senate and enlisting support for that position among their constituents, it was possible to secure such modification of the measure that it could be adopted without greatly endangering the revenue. But a president cannot, with success, constantly appeal to the country. After a time he will get no response. The people have their own affairs to look after, and cannot give much attention to what the Congress is doing. If he takes a position and stands by it, ultimately it will be adopted. Most of the policies set out in my first annual message have become law, but it took several years to get action on some of them. One of the most perplexing and at the same time most important functions of the President is the making of appointments. In some few cases he acts alone, but usually they are made with the advice and consent of the Senate. It is the practice to consult senators of his own party before making an appointment for their state. In choosing persons for service over the whole or any considerable portion of a single state, it is customary to rely almost entirely on the party senators from that state for recommendations. It is not possible to find men who are perfect. Selection always has to be limited to human beings, whatever choice is made. It is therefore always possible to point out defects. The supposition that no one should be appointed who has had experience in the field which he is to supervise is extremely detrimental to the public service. An interstate commerce commissioner is much better qualified if he knows something about transportation. A federal trade commissioner can render much better service if he has had a legal practice which extended into large business transactions. The assertion of those who contend that persons accepting a government appointment would betray their trust in favor of former associates can be understood only on the supposition that those who make it feel that their own tenure of public service is for the purpose of benefiting themselves and their friends. Everyone knows that where the treasure is, there will the heart be also. When a man has invested his personal interest and reputation in the conduct of a public office, if he goes wrong it will not be because of former relations, but because he is a bad man. The same interests that reached him would reach any bad man, irrespective of former life history. What we need in appointive positions is men of knowledge and experience who have sufficient character to resist temptations. If that standard is maintained, we need not be concerned about their former activities. If it is not maintained, all the restrictions on their past employment that can be conceived will be of no avail. The more experience I have had in making appointments, the more I am convinced that attempts to put limitations on the appointing power are a mistake. It should be possible to choose a well-qualified person wherever he can be found. When restrictions are placed on residence, occupation, or profession, it almost always happens that someone is found who is universally admitted to be the best qualified, but who is eliminated by the artificial specifications. So long as the Senate has the power to reject nominations, there is little danger that a president would abuse his authority if he were given the largest possible freedom in his choices. The public service would be improved if all vacancies were filled by simply appointing the best ability and character that can be found. That is what is done in private business. The adoption of any other course handicaps the government in all its operations. In determining upon all his actions, however, the President has to remember that he is dealing with two different minds. One is the mind of the country, largely intent upon its own personal affairs, and while not greatly interested in the government, yet desirous of seeing it conducted in an orderly and dignified manner for the advancement of the public welfare. Those who compose this mind wish to have the country prosperous and are opposed to unjust taxation and public extravagance. At the same time, they have a patriotic pride which moves them with so great a desire to see things well done that they are willing to pay for it. They gladly contribute their money to place the United States in the lead. In general, they represent the public opinion of the land. But they are unorganized, formless, and inarticulate. Against a compact and well-drilled minority, they do not appear to be very effective. They are nevertheless the great power in our government. I have constantly appealed to them, and have seldom failed in enlisting their support. They are the court of last resort, and their decisions are final. They are, however, the indirect rather than the direct power. The immediate authority with which the President has to deal is vested in the political mind. In order to get things done, he has to work through that agency. Some of our presidents have appeared to lack comprehension of the political mind. Although I have been associated with it for many years, I always found difficulty in understanding it. It is a strange mixture of vanity and timidity, of an obsequious attitude at one time and a delusion of grandeur at another time, of the most selfish preference combined with the most sacrificing patriotism. The political mind is the product of men in public life who have been twice spoiled. They have been spoiled with praise, and they have been spoiled with abuse. With them nothing is natural, everything is artificial. A few rare souls escape these influences and maintain a vision and a judgment that are unimpaired. They are a great comfort to every president and a great service to their country, but they are not sufficient in number so that the public business can be transacted like a private business. It is because in their hours of timidity the Congress becomes subservient to the importunities of organized minorities that the President comes more and more to stand as the champion of the rights of the whole country. Organizing such minorities has come to be a well-recognized industry at Washington. They are oftentimes led by persons of great ability, who display much skill in bringing their influences to bear on the Congress. They have ways of securing newspaper publicity, deluging senators and representatives with petitions, and overwhelming them with imprecations that are oftentimes decisive in securing the passage of bills. While much of this legislation is not entirely bad, almost all of it is excessively expensive. If it were not for the rules of the House and the veto power of the President, within 2 years these activities would double the cost of the government. Under our system, the President is not only the head of the government, but is also the head of his party. The last 20 years have witnessed a decline in party spirit and a distinct weakening in party loyalty. While an independent attitude on the part of the citizen is not without a certain public advantage, yet it is necessary under our form of government to have political parties. Unless someone is a partisan, no one can be an independent. The Congress is organized entirely in accordance with party policy. The parties appeal to the voters in behalf of their platforms. The people make their choice on those issues. Unless those who are elected on the same party platform associate themselves together to carry out its provisions, the election becomes a mockery. The independent voter who has joined with others in placing a party nominee in office finds his efforts were all in vain, if the person he helps elect refuses or neglects to keep the platform pledges of his party. Many occasions arise in the Congress when party lines are very properly disregarded. But if there is to be a reasonable government proceeding in accordance with the express mandate of the people, and not merely at the whim of those who happen to be victorious at the polls, on all the larger and important issues there must be party solidarity. It is the business of the President, as party leader, to do the best he can to see that the declared party platform purposes are translated into legislative and administrative action. Oftentimes I secured support from those without my party, and had opposition from those within my party, in attempting to keep my platform pledges. Such a condition is entirely anomalous. It leaves the President as the sole repository of party responsibility. But it is one of the reasons that the presidential office has grown in popular estimation and favor, while the Congress has declined. The country feels that the President is willing to assume responsibility, while his party in the Congress is not. I have never felt it was my duty to attempt to coerce senators or representatives, or to take reprisals. The people sent them to Washington. I felt I had discharged my duty when I had done the best I could with them. In this way I avoided almost entirely a personal opposition, which I think was of more value to the country than to attempt to prevail through arousing personal fear. Under our system, it ought to be remembered that the power to initiate policies has to be centralized somewhere. Unless the party leaders exercising it can depend on loyalty and organization support, the party in which it is proposed will become entirely ineffective. A party which is ineffective will soon be discarded. If a party is to endure as a serviceable instrument of government for the country, it must possess and display a healthy spirit of party loyalty. Such manifestation in the Congress would do more than anything else to rehabilitate it in the esteem and confidence of the country. It is natural for a man to seek power. It was because of this trait of human nature that the founders of our institutions provided a system of checks and balances. They placed all their public officers under constitutional limitations. They had little fear of the courts and were inclined to regard legislative bodies as the natural champions of their liberties. They were very apprehensive that the executive might seek to exercise arbitrary powers. Under our Constitution, such fears seldom have been well founded. The President has tended to become the champion of the people because he is held solely responsible for his acts. While in the Congress, where responsibility is divided, it has developed that there is much greater danger of arbitrary action. It has therefore become increasingly imperative that the President should resist any encroachment upon his constitutional powers. One of the most important of these is the power of appointment. The Constitution provides that he shall nominate and by and with the advice and consent of the Senate appoint. A constant pressure is exerted by the senators to make their own nominations, and the Congress is constantly proposing laws which undertake to deprive the President of the appointive power. Different departments and bureaus are frequently supporting measures that would make them self-perpetuating bodies, to which no appointments could be made that they did not originate. While I have always sought cooperation and advice, I have likewise resisted these efforts, sometimes by refusing to adopt recommendations, and sometimes by the exercise of the veto power. One of the farm relief bills, and later a public health measure, had these clearly unconstitutional limitations on the power of appointment. In the defense of the rights and liberties of the people, it is necessary for the President to resist all encroachments upon his lawful authority. All of these trials and encouragements come to each President. It is impossible to explain them. Even after passing through the presidential office, it still remains a great mystery. Why one person is selected for it and many others are rejected cannot be told. Why people respond as they do to its influence seems to be beyond inquiry. Any man who has been placed in the White House cannot fear that it is the result of his own exertions or his own merit. Some power outside and beyond him becomes manifest through him. As he contemplates the workings of his office, he comes to realize with an increasing sense of humility that he is but an instrument in the hands of God.